the great conservative movement of America and of our time. A brush fire of freedom that's being lit all over this country. We, as an irate, tireless American populace, will overcome the few radical leftists that control the levers of power today. Joe Biden's failed economic policies has given us inflation like you can't believe, and the border is in disarray.
It's amazing how few of the people commenting on this have actually bothered to go see what's happening. Well, Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona actually went to the border.
Biggs, where's Andy? Boy, oh boy, Andy. There's a guy. He's tough.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Biggs, Congressman from Arizona's 5th Congressional District. I'm grateful that you join us today on another of our semi-regular editions of What's the Biggs Idea. It's our podcast that we get out there just about every week. Sometimes we don't make it, but we're glad we can start off this week on a Monday with it. And I have a special guest with me today. I'm very excited. I heard him speak just a few weeks ago. The Utah State Treasurer, Marlo Oaks. Marlo, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Andy.
Yeah, so Treasurer Oaks has 17 years overseeing multi-billion-dollar portfolios at Farmers Insurance and then Intermountain Healthcare. He has a BA in economics from Brigham Young University and a Master of Business Administration from UCLA Anderson School of Business. He's accomplished. He understands very clearly what our topic is, and that is this terribly woke movement of ESG, environmental, social, governance principles that seems to be taking over the corporate boardroom and actually federal government bureaucracies and maybe even in the state bureaucracies of Utah. I don't know. Marlo, thanks for being here. Tell us a little bit about what ESG is for any of the uninitiated.
Yeah, so ESG, like a lot of things that people latch onto, it sounds really nice. It sounds good, right? The environment, social, governance, these are terms that have, positive connotations to them. Who would be against the environment, right? And who's against social justice? And then, of course, governance. The traditional, it's really kind of the traditional idea of helping corporations to be more profitable. And so this package coming together is really kind of an interesting phenomenon in our capital markets. It really grows out of socially responsible investing. But there's some very important differences between socially responsible investing and ESG. So if you think about kind of traditional and values-based investment strategies, socially responsible investing was adopted really by religious organizations centuries ago even, that said, we have certain values, we don't want to participate in profiteering against those values, so we will avoid investing in certain companies and industries. So, tobacco, firearms, gambling, those are typical socially responsible investment screens. It's a divestment strategy. So instead of, having exposure to these companies, you just simply avoid them. Now that importantly works within the context of our free enterprise system. Investors that have that kind of strategy allow other investors to have different values from their own. And they're not trying to change businesses to reflect their values. They're simply implementing a strategy that reflects their beliefs and allowing other investors to have different beliefs. ESG is very different. It actually has an agenda to achieve. And when you have an agenda to achieve, when you're trying to do it through the capital markets, you have to have a lot of capital that believes that same agenda or is committed to that same agenda. And so ESG really takes socially responsible investing to a whole different level and essentially changes our market-based system into one that is driving political agendas like we've never seen before. And so I believe this is a threat not just to our market-based system, but also to our constitutional form of government, because now we're seeing businesses drive politics. Businesses have always been involved in politics, or at least historically. There's certainly precedents for businesses being involved in politics, certainly over the last century. But what did that look like? That looked like supporting a candidate or candidates. That looked like lobbying. It was working within the confines of the political system to protect the interests of a corporation. What we're seeing today now is companies taking policy that didn't make it through Congress or didn't make it through legislative bodies and pushing that agenda through the capital markets. And it threatens the capital markets because the only way, as I said, you can do that is to have a lot of money that believes the same thing, that is willing to do the same thing.
So Marlo, there is so much to unpack with what you just said. So I want to see if we can unpack just a little bit with some examples. So let's take Anheuser-Busch, for instance. So in the past, as an investor, I could either find a mutual fund that didn't, because I don't drink beer or whatever, if I had a moral objection to the distribution of beer, et cetera, for whatever reason, I would either personally make a choice not to invest and buy shares of Anheuser-Busch, or if I was in a mutual fund or some other fund, I would try to find one that also either limited or did not buy stock in Anheuser-Busch. That was the pre-ESG way of kind of just personally being within the market without distorting the market. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Aligning your values with your portfolio.
So then we get to you have the wokeism of transgender becoming the face of Budweiser, and that seems to be getting a good high ESG score, although it's not good for the stockholders because they've actually taken a pretty good beating in the market. So how does that get reconciled? What used to be considered the fiduciary duty to the stockholders to maximize the value of the stock through business decisions that work, and choosing someone that you want to get a good ESG score because you have woke values. How does that mix in?
Yeah, so you have to remember that at the heart of ESG, or really the concept that is animating ESG, is stakeholder capitalism. Traditionally in this country, we have had shareholder capitalism, or the focus of the corporation being to maximize shareholder value, obviously within the context of the laws and ethical considerations. When we change to stakeholder capitalism, it's a term that, like ESG, can be misunderstood. So stakeholder capitalism is the idea that a company needs to serve its employees, its customers, its suppliers, the communities in which it operates. Those are all actually traditional shareholder capitalism concepts, but they've been co-opted by this stakeholder capitalism agenda, because that's similar to shareholder capitalism. What people don't understand, though, is that stakeholder capitalism goes one step further and says, actually, the corporation needs to serve society and society's goals. And so when that becomes the goal of the corporation, then when corporations have to serve societal goals, that's when it changes fundamentally from serving the owners to serving society. When you're serving society, you have to adopt then political agendas. In the case of Anheuser-Busch, a lot of these corporations are being provided a rating by the Human Rights Campaign. They have an index, and my understanding, and I haven't looked into this closely, but I've been told this, is that those corporations are being pushed in order to get a good human rights campaign score, whatever that index is. I've forgotten the name of it. They need to have transgender advertising as part of their advertising, campaigns.
So this, okay, just a whole series of additional questions. Okay, so stakeholder capitalism together with ESG and World Economic Forum and their writings that I've read, they seem to come together. So I would love for you to address that. And then I guess the question really is, how did ESG come about? When did it begin? And I mean, I was reading like a Forbes piece on this from 2019, so 4 years ago now, and they were it was an opinion piece, but that individual, given a forum by Forbes, was advocating for ESG. So when did this all really get going, and where does it end?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's easier to tag the beginning, certainly. That goes back to 2004. There was a UN document titled "Who Cares Wins?" And the UN had invited financial services companies, major financial services companies from around the world, to gather together. And the phrase or the paragraph that really caught my attention was one that said, only if all actors come together to, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, to integrate environmental, social, and governance criteria into their investment decision-making process can any significant improvements be made in this field. When you say all actors, only when all actors come together to integrate ESG, and that was the first time that those three words had been published in a document, that, as far as I know. You no longer have a market if you have all actors come together. That's called collusion. It is antitrust, serious antitrust issues, which these entities that have signed on to these net zero climate initiatives are starting to realize. That's why we're seeing insurance companies, major insurance companies, step away. That's why Vanguard stepped away from the asset managers net zero climate initiative. These are NGOs, the international bodies that have gone around to financial institutions and had them commit to net zero climate initiatives. And in the case of, and it's primarily focused on the financial services sector. So there's a vertical for banks, there's a vertical for insurance companies, for asset owners, asset managers. Why are they focused on the financial services? Because that is the foundation of any capitalist system, is the allocation of capital. If companies have to pay a price for having the wrong policy, then you can drive behavior more easily. And so by having the levers, by capturing the levers of the financial system, you can drive companies to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, that otherwise are not in the best interest of the owners of the company, the shareholders. So that's really one of the keys. The other key here is stakeholder capitalism, and you referred to it a little bit with the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab has been he's kind of the founder of the World Economic Forum. He has been a major proponent of stakeholder capitalism for the last 50 years. And he and Milton Friedman would often spar. Milton Friedman got the better of him while he was still alive, basically arguing for the supremacy of shareholder capitalism. But now we're seeing the World Economic Forum coming together with the United Nations in an agreement to push the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are similar in feel to ESG. Really, the idea behind ESG and the UN Sustainable Development Goals is that people have come together, experts around the world have come together to determine what are the greatest threats to humanity or what are our greatest challenges. And then they come together and say, all right, here's the greatest challenges, here's the solutions to those challenges, and everybody around the world needs to jump on board and and try to meet those solutions.
So I find myself just baffled that the boardrooms have been taken over. I don't think we could get there if we had an education system that was not indoctrinating in this way. So I don't want to get there because but I think that that's part and parcel to this whole thing. But I also the way I view this actually has some authoritarian and some fascism tendencies to it. But I'm trying to see where the government is, because right now I don't know of outside of bureaucracy setting these up as rules with their contractors. I don't see the government actually formally, at least out of the Congress anyway. We have not done anything that said we're going to do ESG based contracting. What have you found?
No, that's interesting. I've become aware of certain areas where ESG seems to be pushed in other ways, like the SBA, the Small Business Administration, with loans to small business, wanting them to adopt, like clean energy into projects where it doesn't make economic sense to do so. This is really politicizing our capital markets. And you see the administrative state, like the SEC, is probably one of the most politicized bodies that is pushing this particular agenda. So they are allowing blatantly illegal shareholder proposals to go before corporate America to try and push corporate America to adopt ESG policies in their companies. So, for example, insurance companies are being pushed to do racial equity audits, even though it's illegal to use race in underwriting. This was approved by the SEC, even though the SEC is supposed to be the gatekeeper for shareholder proposals and stop proposals that are harmful to companies and dictate how their traditional business operations function. That's not a shareholder responsibility to change the business operations of an entity. And yet we're seeing the SEC allow those kinds of proposals to get through and to get onto the ballot. And then these massive investment managers are voting the shares in a way that's consistent with ESG principles, even though most of the money that they manage are not in ESG labeled funds. This is another serious problem where investors don't even realize that the money that they have, particularly in index funds, are being used to push an agenda that they probably don't agree with. Certainly not all shareholders agree with it. And yet the investment managers have said ESG risk and climate risk are investment risk. Therefore, we can use all of the assets that we are managing to push this agenda. It's hugely dishonest.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, if you just joined us, we're with Utah State Treasurer Marlo Oaks. And Marlo, this is just so fascinating because I see it's going to just spread to every aspect. I mean, you're talking capital markets. We've already seen the attempt to, like, if you're a gun manufacturer, ammunition manufacturer, they want to dry up your capital. That's the left's proposal there. And I've literally watched executives of some of the biggest oil and gas producers in the world come to our committees and commit that they're basically going to put their own company out of business by adopting solar and wind. I'm astounded by that. What have you seen, and what are you trying to do as the Utah State Treasurer as you manage the funds for the state to make sure that are you avoiding the ESG constraints that seem to be out there right now in the capital markets?
Yeah, I think one of the keys that I talk about is having a voice on the other side, because right now the only voice that these corporations are hearing is from the far left, and I believe, and I've seen polls that show this, that most Americans don't want business to be politicized. Most Americans recognize the need for oil and energy. It's a national security issue. And so they don't want the United States to cripple itself in the name of ESG. And so one of the key things that we can do is have our voice heard in the marketplace. And so, we've written letters, certainly to the administration, but we're also looking at our proxy voting and ensuring that the proxy voting that is done with the money that we oversee is done in a way that is consistent with fiduciary principles. And it's really important for people to understand, ESG is really trying to push a political agenda. The anti-ESG push, like what I'm working on, is not a mirror image of that. We are not pushing politics. We are not trying to push a center-right political agenda in corporate America. We're simply trying to get the finger off of the scale so that capital markets can operate the way they always have, and get politics out of business and preserve the neutrality of business. That's a very important part of this. Is people want to go to business, to go to work, not be worried about the politics and everybody's politics, right? And be afraid to say something. We want to go to a place where we can work together as Americans on a common cause, and business has been that for the history of this country. Now we're seeing things being politicized that have never been politicized before, and it hurts everybody.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up about the politicization of this, because, if you read Solzhenitsyn, but beyond Solzhenitsyn, even the MiG pilot who defected, Belenko, and others, they talked about being in the former Soviet Union, or if you talk about being in China now, there is a political officer everywhere. And so if you're in the military, every day, the political officer would come in for an hour and indoctrinate you into this. And this politicization really is anti-freedom, it's authoritarian, and it's going to make it really difficult for us to compete. Do you have any insight in how China has used ESG?
Well, it's interesting. I spoke in a town last February. Just gave a 5-minute talk on ESG, and the keynote speaker was a woman by the name of Lily Tang Williams, who grew up in the Cultural Revolution in China. And there were apparently some communist Chinese in attendance at dinner. And they said, ESG is great and Lily is lying. And so this really ESG plays into the hands of China, because it undermines our national security, it undermines our innovation, it undermines our competitiveness around the world. And China isn't beholden to this. China is a developing country, and so is given a pass on a lot of the kind of global regulations, if you will, that other developed countries hold themselves to. And so vis-a-vis our major adversary in the world, we are harming ourselves significantly. Not only that, but think about clean energy. China has monopolized the solar panels and wind, production. And so the more we push to go to, green energy, we just have to think very strategically and carefully. We're actually becoming more dependent on China. And so we harm our own interests by hurting our independence, energy independence, and becoming more dependent on China by going into clean energy.
Wow. Marlo, Every time I talk to you, I feel like I get a little bit smarter, that you're giving me more information, and I really appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, Andy Biggs here. We've been talking with Utah State Treasurer Marlo Oaks. And Marlo, if people wanted to follow you on Twitter and get to your website, where would they go?
Yeah, so at Marlo Oaks, and then website is marlooaks.com, marlooaks.com.
I'd encourage you to follow Marlo, see what he's doing. He's doing good things in Utah. Marlo, thanks for taking some time out with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy. It's
I
great
look
to be
forward
with
to seeing you again. And folks, if you want to follow me, you can go to @RepAndyBiggsAZ. You can go to biggs.house.gov. If you want to hear this on audio, you can go either to Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And, we'll be back, as I say, sometime in the next 7 to 10 days on our semi-regular podcast. Again, Marlo, thanks so